Welcome to African Black Psychology in the American Context as we discuss the Maafa, the African Holocaust in the Americas. In this chapter, we'll discuss the Maafa, which we've identified already as the key Swahili term coined by Mirumba Ani as the Great Disaster to represent the what people call the triangular trade, but the period of enslavement for African people. The Maafa refers to the violent Eurasian cultural encroachment on Africa and the enslavement by Africans by Eurasians in general. The enslavement of African people reflect 400 years of enslavement of Africans throughout the American hemisphere. The Maafa was a 500 to 1500 year saga of literal cultural devastation for African people throughout the continent of Africa and abroad. Prior to that, 1,000 years of Arab enslavement occurred, and the Arabs under Islam were enslaving African people all throughout North Africa. We also have the Portuguese under Christianity enslaving Africans in Europe. Each of these pictures represent or attempt to depict some form of information related to the enslavement of African people. Oftentimes we hear African people being called slaves or their history of being slaves. And we want to challenge the concept of calling an African a slave, arguing or suggesting that the African was not a slave. The African was a human being whose condition was slavery. So to be a human being under the condition of slavery meant to be a human being whose humanity was denied, where there was inconceivable trauma, psychological trauma, mental, emotional, physical trauma, horror, unimaginable, misery and suffering, violence, aggression. So for African people, the Maafa caused the African to disconnect psychologically from anything and physically from anything consciously African. As a result of the Maafa, African people completely lost their sense of cultural identity and any connection with the indigenous historical culture. The challenge in understanding the phenomenon of the enslavement of African people in North America is that it was a little different than what the Africans on the continent believed would be the case. African people thought that the slavery was more of a reflection of indentured servitude and less of being committed of a criminal act and a prisoner of war. The presentation or how African people experience enslavement in the Americas was that of a prisoner of war, almost as if those innocent African people had committed crimes and were being treated violently and aggressively, as opposed to loaning one out for repayment. Meaning you go, you work, support the family or institution that purchased you, and then you get to go back home. For us as Africans in America, we have not been able to return home, and I argue again that African people are still in comfortable captivity. That was by Baba Jacob Brothers. The capture of African people, you have to consider or understand how African people entered into the American context. First, on the continent of Africa, Europeans led sponsored ambushes of individuals or groups of Africans on night attacks and raids in African villages. Oftentimes, they would trade with individual leaders. The leaders of the chiefs, again, based on African cosmology and worldview, thought that what the African was being traded to was more a reflection of indentured servitude and not the raw violence and inability to return home that the African experienced in the Americas. So the leaders did actually trade African bodies. This shows a hull of a ship and how African people were laid head to foot in an effort to maximize the space on the ship and get as many African bodies in and across the water most of the way. Before we get to that part, we have the slave march, and that's where the Africans marched to the coast for shipping. Oftentimes, hundreds of miles would be covered, taking a few days to several weeks for the enslaved or captured African to arrive at the destination. Europeans often brutally beat and frequently killed many of the captured Africans. Women also were constantly raped on these captive journeys. Families, loved ones, friends were separated, and the objective of the slave march was to get as many captured Africans to the coast onto the slave ship as possible with the least expenditure or the least loss of resource. Once the African arrived to the coast, the dungeons, this is the coast in Ghana, I can't think of it. Africans walked and stayed in dungeons for days, months to a year, waiting for transport to the Americas. So for those who survived this very exhausting journey and reached the coast, they were placed in these dungeons, stripped of their clothes, branded with red hot irons. Even the heads were shaven so they could have no connection to the tribe or nation or group of people that they were a part of. And they were put in iron chains on the ankles and or the neck for again a few days to a year, where they sat and waited to be transported from this place to the Americas. This shows two examples of the dungeons and leg irons. Another important component of this is a door of no return. The saying is that once the Africans walked out of this door, they were never to return to Africa. And like Baba Jacob Brothers said, we are in comfortable captivity. Some Africans, many Africans, the majority of African people have not returned to the continent to find their long lost family. So this was an actual example of a door of no return. Upon the slave ships, African people were packed in, essentially, like sardines, packed and wedged together, brutally sexually assaulted and raped. They had to live in their own waste, meaning feces and urine and excrement throughout the voyage. Vomit, because of the volatility of the hull of the ship, and the food that was not standard for the African body would cause Africans to vomit. So sometimes the greed of the enslaver caused them to unwisely overload ships, and to avoid penalty or any issues of legality, they would choose to throw Africans overboard or murder them first and then throw them overboard to lighten the load for legal reasons. When the bodies landed in the ocean, or this shows an example of bodies being packed from head to foot to maximize space, again in chains and not able to move once placed. This gives another example. This is an example of the grouping of the human bodies in these ships and how tightly the African humans were packed. Sometimes the ships would be so overrun they expected people to die on this 6 month to the 3 to 6 month journey. So they overpacked and then threw the excess human bodies overboard. So I said 6 months. What is that? 3, 6, 2.5. The length of the voyage was anywhere from 40 to 80 days. 3,000 to 6,000 miles. Some will argue that I've heard 12 million Africans, but over 50 million Africans were taken from the continent of Africa, dumped into the bottom of the ocean, or those who landed on the coast of the United States were then left to suffer even more. So that concludes this first unit I'm re-recording because there was issue with volume on the first one. So hopefully I gathered all the information until the next mini lecture. Thank you.